for coming back, and thank you for those who are here for the first time. If you're here for the first time and you're looking for the bathroom, it's that way. It's through the hall on the right, so that's always important to establish that. I forgot to hand these out when you all were coming in, but if these are on a table over there by the bar, and on the back, a couple things. It lists upcoming guests, and so you know who's coming. The next one after tonight will be on December 3rd, featuring a friend of Melina's, David Zoll, who's wonderful, an author that many of us have read, and it's going to be an excellent evening. And so do take this, and then there's also a QR code if you're able to donate to offset costs for food and beverage. You can scan that and donate online. So thank you to all those who have done that. Also, we've made these flyers for all of the events going on with children's and family events. So especially since tonight is sort of children and family adjacent, please do pick up one of those if you haven't got it already. And finally, I'd like to introduce our guest tonight. So Melina Smith, I actually met her husband a long time ago. I don't even remember how we met. Maybe through Dave Zoll. Who knows? Okay, but he's a priest in New York City. Jacob Smith. He's at Calvary St. George, a great church in New York City. If you're ever up in New York City, and then eventually I saw that his wife was doing this really cool stuff, basically they created this. What would you call it? A sort of creative curriculum, yeah, that's meant for children's formation, but a lot of children's formation ends up one way or the other. Oftentimes, it's either just all about play, and there's very little theology, and some of these curriculums were done 40 years ago, and they just feel sort of old and sad and stuff. And then other times, there's like a more stringent approach where it's a lot of memorization but very little imagination. And so Storymakers has really brought these two things together in such a wonderful way. And so Melina will get more into that. But this is the program that we've adopted here in our own children's program. And my kids are in it, and they love it. And Melina got to join them today, which was wonderful. So number one, you get to see a little bit about what we're doing here at St. John's. And then also, Melina's thought a lot about what it means to pass along a living faith to the next generation. And so I'm excited to see what she has to say. But the last thing I'll say is she brought a bunch of materials so that you can get an idea if you haven't looked at their website, which is storymakersnyc.com. But if you haven't done that, go over by the bar. There are a bunch of materials. You can take a look and get a sense of what they do. So with that, I'd like to welcome up Melina.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having me. I am always so encouraged and pleasantly surprised by the way God puts us in all sorts of different places. I get to go all over the place. A couple weeks ago, I was in Connecticut with another parish, and I can just tell you, be encouraged. God is on the move all over the place, especially in the church. So before we get started, I always want to start with prayer and just get our minds in the right spot. So we will go ahead and start there. The Lord be with you.
And with thy spirit.
Dear Jesus, thank you for tonight. Thank you for all the people gathered here today who care about your church and care about the next generation. We ask that you would be with me and that you would speak through me, and that your peace that surpasses all understanding would fall on our hearts and our minds, and by the power of your Holy Spirit, that you would move us and excite us for the way in which we can connect to the next generation. Amen.
Amen.
Well, like Father Jameson said, we met through my husband, who's a priest at Calvary St. George's Church. We've been in New York for almost 20 years. I'm a kid from New York City. I mean, not from New York City, actually. I'm from Arizona, and so is my husband. And I just can't tell you enough about how God is so full of surprises. My husband's from the border of Arizona. I am from Tucson, Arizona, and somehow we ended up in New York for the last 20 years, and we are doing gospel ministry, and I can't believe that Storymakers exists. It is just such a complete surprise. And I say all this to say is that as we think about Gen Z and this next generation coming up, and we think about what's the future of the church, we can trust that God is full of surprises, plot twists, and he's never finished with us. So as we, heightened anxiety comes along with the fear of like, what are my kids going to do? Where are my grandkids going to land? We can trust that God has come for us and he's going to come for them. So when we talk about such a big macro question, I think it's important for us to get down to the micro. And I think it's important for us to think about personally, like, who do you care about? When we ask the question, what about the church? What about Gen Z? What about Alpha? Who are you really thinking about? When we have these questions and they're way, way, way out there, we add a lot of distance and conjecture to the solutions, and we forget that those people are real, and they're people in our households, and they're people that we care about, and they're the kids on the street, and it's about the church that we really love and hold dear. So I want you guys to think about that and hold that person or people in your mind. Well, Storymakers, we talk a lot about imagination and sparking faith through the imagination. And one of the things that I love to always share is that Walt Disney said that over time, our imaginations grow flabby. And I used to use this illustration all the time. And I used to say, we need imagination in Sunday school. We need imagination everywhere, because over time it grows flabby because we don't access. But I don't actually think that's true. I think as we get older, our imaginations shift towards the negative. I think that we lose that childlike faith, and then we begin to imagine the worst. The church isn't going to work out. If I don't exist, this isn't going to happen. If I don't tell them in this specific way, they are not going to trust God's story. And so it's not really about the orientation. It's not about our imaginations and not having an access point to it. Maybe our imaginations go way wild as we get older rather than decrease. And maybe we need to remember the stories for ourselves so that our minds can be reoriented. And the same is true for Gen Z and how we think about them going into the future. I think this is really important for us to grasp before we dive right in. So as I go through these slides, I'm going to share with you some insights that we have about Gen Z and Alpha. This is not some generation that is not interested in faith. They actually are very much interested in faith. They're really anxious and they're really afraid. So they're primed for church, right? Because Jesus is a solution to all of our fear and anxiety. One of the things my daughter told me, I was on a walk with her, and she's 16 years old, and I said to her, I said, Sophia, like, what's going on with your faith? And I don't really talk to her like that. And I just said, I'm your mom. I should probably check in. You're going away for the semester. Like, how are you feeling about that? And she said, I get really terrified at night. So, like, all I got is Jesus. And so I thought, well, that is a really interesting thought. Like, our fear and anxiety is an opportunity, and we know that they're full of it. When we look at the statistics of what's going on with this next generation, it's so easy to see. Rates of suicide are up. I mean, there's a litany of terrible data about Gen Z and what Alpha is dealing with. And so what do we have to offer? The church has so much to offer. We have to offer an imagination of hope and the possibility that there is peace of mind and heart, and the God who created them is with them and for them. And so this is the way in which we form all of our, formation materials, our teen materials. And so what we're trying to do is create an entry point. We want to get connected to Gen Z. We want to meet them where they are. And Jesus did this for all of us, right? Through the parables, through the stories. He wasn't disconnected from who we are in our humanity. He came straight to us. And so that's what we're called to do with our kids. That's what we're called to do with Gen Z. And so that means we get visual and we meet them right where they are, right? So they are growing up in the digital age. If you're an Alpha kid, you were born in 2010. If you're in part of Generation Z, then you were born in 1996. So we know that they have been raised with post 9/11. We know that they are in a fast and furious social media culture. They have a lot to contend with, and so does the church. And so they want to know, what do we have to say to them? And so this is where Storymakers steps in. We have been thinking a lot about this. Like, how can we equip the church? How can we equip grown-ups who care about kids with the materials that will help meet that next generation? And so as a good Episcopalian, we love the catechisms because it's been rooting the church forever. And so we lean into those foundational cornerstones for our kids as we're approaching them. And I think it's something that we can all bring to them. And it's something that we need to remember these promises for ourselves. One thing I always emphasize as we sort of navigate how to respond to the next generation, how to think about them, is to stop and think and remember our own baptism and the promises that are over us. So as you attempt to engage, as you attempt to love, remember those promises that were poured over you as you go forward with them. Like Father Jemison said, I think there are two routes that we often end up with. We end up in chaos or rigidity. So we end up being like the super cool mom and, everything is free flowing and you can do whatever you want and you be you. That's one category people land in. Or you land in the space of rigidity. Both of those are areas in which you're not, the chaos is like uncertainty. You're not certain how to guide and lead with love and truth. And then the rigidity is control. And that's just that everybody knows how that turns out, right? So we don't want to land in those spaces, but we want to offer truth and guidance. And we know that they're asking a lot of questions. And we can offer those answers, but in a way that meets them exactly where they are. So I'm going to go ahead and get started and let you know about what we've been learning about Gen Z. So one of the things, start at the beginning. Doubt isn't what kills faith, silence is. So one of the things that we really lean hard on is Barna. So if you're ever curious about data, about Gen Z or Alpha, Barna is a place to go. And the Fuller Youth Institute has come out with a lot of data around Gen Z. And what they're finding is that because there hasn't been enough space for the questions to be asked, kids feel disassociated from the church. But that is not to say that they ask questions and then grown-ups just let them kind of wander without an answer. They need answers, but they need to be engaged in a way that is meaningful for them. So this is an important aspect of Alpha. One of the things I wanted to highlight is this artist that we became familiar with. Her name is Ida Moulinet, and she is from Ethiopia, and she's a photographer. And I thought that she was a really good example of how we can connect visually with Gen Z, and this is something that we do all the time. I think art is a great point of connection. Back in the day, I was a behavior therapist when I lived in Pittsburgh, and I worked with really tough kids, and I worked with the dual diagnosed. And one of the ways that I always made connections was through art. We were always able to have conversations and points of connections, and I think I offer that as an idea for you all as you're building connections. And so I wanted to share this piece of art with you to build a connection so you can understand the power of art and the power of water. So one of the things that Ida identified was that when she's trying to communicate something difficult, like the lack of water in Africa and the trials that women have to bear in bringing art to communities, she wanted to do this with in a way that was visually compelling and beautiful. One thing that Madeline Leigh Engel says about art is that good art always identifies the chaos, but offers hope and points us to the cosmos. And so this is a great example from Ida of something that's so beautiful, identifying the chaos, which is the difficulty of having water, and pointing towards hope because it's so beautiful, right? And so if I were to talk to a student or alphas about this picture, I could talk to them about baptism. I could talk to them about how it's a struggle for us we receive baptism, we don't earn baptism, but experience the receptivity of that baptism and those promises over us all the time is a struggle. And I think that's a struggle for us as grown-ups as well. We become, the idea of baptism becomes so distant from us. So having these sorts of opportunities, using art to make these connections and build these bridges. I saw this piece of art and I said, I would use this in youth group. I would talk to my kids about this. I would talk to them about baptism with this visual. And what a different way to have a conversation about baptism than just, hey, Sophia, like, what do you think about your baptism? How's that feeling for you these days? Those promises covering you? Like, we can have a much more meaningful conversation around this piece of art because it just opens the door. We always say art is the back door to the heart. And Gen Z and Alpha have amazing digital art coming to them all the time. They are being raised in an age where ads and everything is beautiful, everything is well done. And so we can lean on the art that we're seeing out in the world to bridge gaps and have conversations with our kids that are meaningful. We love to set the table. I think that's an important thing to do as parents. One thing that we all desperately need, even us as grown-ups, is to be heard and to feel known. And our kids are so saturated and inundated. They're overstimulated with their phones, with all the things that are coming to them at all times. And so what we always suggest is that you set the table and create space and opportunities and times to listen to your kids and to listen. And even if they're not your kids, they're kids in the congregation or teens, it's an important way for them to feel connected to and known. And so, just like I just showed you that piece of art, that's a perfect opportunity to have a conversation that sets the table and the tone. I keep talking about baptism, and this is really important. Baptism is so important for all of us. It reminds us to whom we belong, and I think that there's so many visually compelling ways to talk about baptism. I think it's important to remember and not to throw out our traditions for Gen Z and for Alpha. I think it's important to remind them that these things are true. And one of the things that they're looking to us as grown-ups is to affirm the truth of the faith that they've been given and that we are inviting them to participate in. And so I would suggest always that we don't need to leave we don't need to leave that behind. We don't need to leave the tradition behind. But they need to know that what we're proposing is actually true. And so when we're talking about these promises and the sacraments, that we need to really have a good understanding that they're actually true and have a meaningful way to talk about them. In our studies and research over the last few years, and as we've been building more materials for Gen Z, we are looking at 6 points of entry, and you can check out those pieces out front. We know that there are 6 points of entry that are really meaningful and important for teens. They are thinking a lot about how we're focusing in on how they're processing their future selves. Gen Z is really saddled up with a future that is insecure. They have been raised in a time where they're being told over and over and over again, the world is on fire. So there's environmental anxiety. There's so many layers of anxiety that's coming at them. So it's no wonder that the statistics are indicating that they have higher levels of despair, because when they think about their future self, it doesn't look that great, my kids and I know their friends are anxious about, like, we only have 6 more years and then we can't turn around the environmental changes. There's just so many things that they're worried about all the time. I'm like, okay, that's a lot. You're 12. They're holding a lot. It's not hard to see. And so we want to talk to them about the future self, not in terms of not in terms of the world, but we want to assure them that God has a story for them, and it's much longer than we can imagine. And this is why the Bible is really important. This is why it's important for us to engage the stories of the Bible with them, so we can point them back and say, like, listen, the world has been on fire for a long, long time, and we're still here. And as long as we're still here, God is with us, and he is leading us forward. And so this is a really important topic for them. It's not to be disregarded. And I know that it's easy for us as grown-ups to say, well, no, it's fine. The world's going to be fine. It's like, well, okay, I hear you. What makes you most anxious? What are you most afraid of? Well, I heard this thing about this and that. Oh, well, that does sound really scary. And well, let's pray about that. Let's stop and think about that, rather than brushing them off. It's important for all of us to understand that they're holding a lot more than we probably were holding, and they're inundated with a lot more than we are. Their nervous systems are on fire, I would say. They have way more information that they have to manage. You know, when you're thinking about social media as a grown-up, I feel overwhelmed by it. You're just scrolling and you see catastrophe, and then you see, like, you know, kittens or something. It's so much. Like, our minds were not meant to process all of that information, and they're having to deal with this all the time. And so we just have to remember that Gen Z is coming to us in a place of, like, low-grade trauma. And they may not have had a trauma at home in particular, but just environmental trauma. And so if we approach them in that way, we'll be better listeners, and they'll feel better, they'll feel connected, and then you can pray with them, and they'll be open for that opportunity. Identity, we all know, is a huge conversation piece for Gen Z. They are saddled up with having to identify all sorts of parts of their bodies, and all sorts. What do they care about most? Who are they going to be in the future? Just, it is a litany of burden that they are carrying around the issue of identity. And so we want to assure them that around the Lord's Prayer, that no matter who they think they are, or if they ever figure themselves out, that God has figured themselves, he has adopted them, they belong to him, and he knows who they are, and they're so known. And so we need to assure them all the time of this truth. They need that information, because they are being saddled up with a burden that none of us probably had to bear. And they're carrying a lot more than we did emotionally. Community is really important. We know that this generation feels more isolated than any other community, any other generation in the past. They feel very lonely. There's a lot of despair in that. And so we want to invite them into community. That is the amazing benefit of the church, right? You rub shoulders up with people you normally would not have chosen for yourself. Like, Jesus is really funny. He brings us together in this community, in these churches, and you think, I would never be friends with that person in real life outside of these doors, but here we are. And he did that on purpose, because we need each other, and we need different people, and we need diversity in that way. And our teens need to be invited into spaces like that. They need older people to care about them and to engage them. And they need young people, and they need to engage with kids too, littles as well, because that shapes them and that pulls them out of themselves, because they need those breaks. They need those opportunities. Like today, we went through the liturgy, and every time we go through communion, we have a moment in which we can pull ourselves away from ourselves and stop navel gazing, and we get to say, like, our lives are not just, it's not just about us personally. And so community offers that, and the church offers that moment for them, and so we need to be inviting them into the church. The faith issue is really about, like, us being able to confidently say, like, this stuff is true. Like, what we're saying in church is actually true. We believe it. It's not about arguing them into the story, but it's just having a comfortability and confidence to be able to say, yeah, I believe that that's true. Yeah, the Apostles' Creed, that's true. And engaging with them in the questions that they have alongside. And the last thing is, obviously, they need a lot of connection and not digital connection. They are saying this generation is more lonely than any other generation, and social media has not helped them feel any more connected. And so that's part of our role as the church, to bring them into that connectivity. So one of the things, I'm just going to kind of scroll through these. These are the ways that we make the connections and process and identity. This is a great example, being able to engage with kids and ask them, like, how do you see yourselves? You know, when you're engaging these kinds of questions, they're going to tell you everything, and then you're going to know. And I was with another organization, and they were taking a look at the identity issue, and they looked at this and they said, well, what if they describe something that I don't really feel comfortable with? And it's like, well, that's actually a point of vulnerability, connection. They've opened the door to you. Like, why would you shut that door? Like, the boys in the basement always come up. So you might want to know what they are before you get, they get too far along. They need to know that they're grown-ups that are advocating for them and that would listen to them and help process their life with them, alongside them. But these are just great examples of how we use visual art to make those connections for them. And you can check out all of our materials out front. I would say, as you're thinking about Gen Z and Alpha and the church, I'd say just be fearless about your confidence. I think it's, we all know what it's like to feel like you're like a project. We want kids to feel like you actually really care and that you're listening and you know them. But be fearless about like what you actually think and believe here in the church. Like, there's no reason to pretend and try to make it palatable in a way that isn't actually authentic or organic or true. And you can always send them to a priest if you don't know the answers. I think that's always good. But I think just be fearless about it, because they really need us right now. They need us to be connected, they need us to be listening, and they need us to assure them that the promises of God that they've been given are actually true and for them. These are, we'll share the slides later as well, but these are some of the resources I would say are useful as you're thinking about how you want to connect. Barna is a great resource, and Madeline LaEngle has a great book called Walking on Water, and that is a great book to inspire you all to step out in faith with your kids and teens. She has a great bit about the 1928 prayer book and when the prayer book was being changed, so you all might be interested in that. Rebecca McLaughlin is an evangelist, and she is a writer, and she is in Boston, and she just came out with a great book, 10 Questions Every Teen Should Ask. The book is she suggests it's for teens. I would say it's really for grown-ups. I think the questions that teens are asking, there's a lot of copy in it, so not many pictures, but I think that they're great. It's a great resource to equip for you all to be equipped so you can have those conversations, those hard ones. Jonathan Haidt is a sociologist based in New York. He's incredible, and he has a lot of insight as to what's happening with girls, with social media. It's just a great point of entry into understanding, like, sociologically what's happening. And David Brooks has a great new book called How to Know a Person. And if you feel like, I'm not a really great listener, I talk too much, I'm not a great communicator, this is the book for you. This is a fantastic way for you to reorient your minds and how to be an active listener and how to know, it's so important for Gen Z that it's so simple. It's like, just listen. Just listen to them and listen to them well and ask the right questions. And so I just wanted to share a few things with you guys and then open it up to Q&A, and then we can have a conversation if you guys have questions about Gen Z and Alpha.
I
Yeah.
Can I start?
Yeah, go for it.
I'm going to come up and ask some questions.
Perfect.
Thank you for all of that. That's so wonderful,
Yeah.
and these resources are great. Um, I think I was wondering, one of the things that when you talked earlier about grown-ups sort of being afraid of the chaos, I found that sort of interesting. Or what did you say, that we've um, that our imaginations aren't flabby, but they sort of have
They
gone.
go in the wrong
They go in the wrong
direction.
direction,
Yeah,
yeah.
because I think we lose sight of our baptism and the promises.
Right.
And
Right.
so then we get afraid, and then we imagine the worst.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that, I mean, to me,
We're
that's
really good at that.
That's connected. Yeah, it's connected to a couple things. On one hand, I think there's maybe an inability. Like, kids are pretty honest about the chaos that they're seeing, and maybe we get to a certain point where we build a framework where we try to ignore some of it. You know, and the framework part can be good, but the biblical framework doesn't ignore the chaos, right?
No.
It digs in, and so I don't know. I thought, like, could you say a little bit more about how we can do that as parents?
Yeah, I mean, right now I have a 16-year-old, so we're having a lot of conversations about the world and how it feels on fire, and it feels very chaotic. And so I would say there's so many stories in the Bible that we see God entering into that chaos. Like Jesus entered into the most chaotic of moments. And God always meets us and steps into those spaces. So when we're helping them navigate these questions, I think it's like you want to find out the question behind the question. And so you want to ask them, like, what are they really asking, and kind of get to the root of it. Because, you know, when you're 15 or 16, you may be concerned about Israel and Palestine and what's happening. But it's like, well, what are you really afraid of, like, behind all of these questions that you're asking? And I think that's where you get to the goods, and then you kind of move and navigate through that space. But I think I was also talking about what happens sometimes with parenting. We kind of either detach and let go, and so our parenting becomes chaotic, and we let kids loose without any framework and any rules of any rules of rules of engagement, or we would become really rigid. And we've seen that with curriculums. You know, that's one of the things we think about, like with Gen Z. Like, they've been raised with really moralistic curriculum or really boring curriculums, and so. So those are the two spaces that people land, and they forget the center of, like, grace and mercy and the story. Yeah.
You guys do that well, thank God. My other question is sort of, this is a little out there, but I mean, you can relate, because you're doing children's ministry in a city, in an Episcopal church, and there's probably Hillsong down the street, or like these other places, and we have, there's a thing that just happens here that we're sort of working against, where kids kind of come up, and maybe they're confirmed, and then they want to go with their kids to, like, an evangelical church. And it's not saying that that's bad, right?
Yeah.
We're glad kids are going to church, but, like, what do you think we have to offer, and how do we communicate that to a kid who wants to hang with their friends?
Yeah.
No, I'll give you one answer from you, and maybe you can dig into it more and have better ones. But you're talking about the sort of weirdness of the community of these churches. It's not just a bunch of people that are going to look exactly like them, and that's a good thing, right? But are there other things that you'd offer of, like, what you would tell your kids, or what you tell kids that want to go to, like,
Well,
cool
I
church?
think because kids are so anxious, the liturgical format is such an incredible rhythm for them to build into practice. And so I think leaning in on that space would be super helpful. Obviously, you guys do such a great job of hospitality, like setting the table and the invitation. But, creating an environment in which, I think we have so much to offer. And the truth is they're probably going to get tired and then come back. So I think we just wait them out because the story's long. And we know that, if we catechize them in a way that's visually compelling, then those moments stay with them. To be heard and known by somebody that you respect and love in the church is so meaningful. I just think about my husband. He grew up in the Episcopal Church. He lived in Finland for a year, left the faith for a hot year, went to a Pentecostal church for a year, and then he got confused. And so he called his priest from childhood, and his priest was, and my husband said to the priest, he said, this Christian thing's not really working for me. And his priest said, well, I mean, it's just true. So, it's not about working for you, it's just true. And so then that was like the gateway into a longer conversation. And so I think that we have that opportunity. So we stay steady with them. We hold the line, and we want them to know that they're always invited and there are opportunities for them to be here with us. And so, you come with us in the morning and you can go to your evening service at night with your friends. That's cool, but you're going to come back in 5 to 10 years, I bet. So, because it's a rhythm that holds true.
We'll open it up for questions. So yeah.
This is more of an observation, but excuse me, you just mentioned rhythm. And I think one thing that our church offers that is not in every Pentecostal church are the seasons of the church and the beautiful rhythm that we have there. And I know when I used to do bulletin boards in the Sunday school room, endlessly cutting out little paper letters, but the Trinity season and the Advent season, and the children can find, I think, can become rooted in that, which is not offered everywhere.
Well, and I think there's so much to the art and the architecture within the church. This is another good book by Alain Botton, The Architecture of Happiness, and he has a chapter on how the church draws us in and through art and architecture. And I think that we can do the same thing. I saw in Sunday school today, you have all of our posters up, but they're markers. It's like iconography. I mean, they're not icons, but we are giving them the stories visually, and that always brings them back. And so we can lean hard in those spaces. And I mean, look at this room. You feel something, it's beautiful, it touches all the senses in a way that feels like, other worlds. So I think we can trust that those experiences are going to be meaningful for them. And when they step back into a church, hopefully it feels the same way. But I think the primary thing is always that the stories feel compelling and that they feel heard, and that we tell them they're true. Yeah.
Could you elaborate on the questions that teens ask? Because from my experience in Gen Z, from me specifically and just friends I've had, we are extremely skeptical.
Mm-hmm.
In more of a curious way, not in a malicious way. A lot of it having to do with historical accuracy or philosophy. And so stories from the Bible don't really help that much, because it's almost like somebody's telling you or putting on a kid's movie that has a good message, but it's it's not really, it didn't actually happen. And then when a Christian, especially someone older, doesn't know the answer, it kind of makes it seem like Christians don't really know or can't actually defend what they
Mm-hmm.
believe in. So I was wondering if you had on this slideshow, or do you know what are things that adults should just have the answer to?
Everything. No, I'm just kidding.
A lot of it is teaching kids that something is true and not really why something is true, and that's really kind of what they want to know.
Yeah, you've nailed it. Gen Z is the most skeptical generation, and they're looking right. It's not a malicious oh, well, I don't believe you. It's well, what are you selling? And maybe I want it, but I don't know. So tell me what you're selling. And so I think that that's totally accurate. I think that we point them to people who know, that we trust, and you point them to Father Jameson, you point them to other people who you trust to know the answers to the questions that they have. The truth is, I think that we haven't been biblically, a lot of us haven't been catechized to understand the Bible really well and have a great lens for it. And so many of us were taught like the Old Testament and the New Testament are sort of these disjointed spaces, and Old Testament God is this, and New Testament is like happy and nice. And so, to be fair, I think that people haven't really been taught really well how to read and interpret the Bible and to understand like the Bible is a redemptive narrative from the beginning all the way to the end. There are two sides, the old and the new, and they're pointing to the middle and they're pointing to Jesus. And that's like the whole thing. That's the function. And there are all these hidden narratives of redemption. Rahab, Rebecca. There's a litany of these characters, cast of characters. And so I think when grown-ups and other people don't have the answers, that's fine. And they should just say, I don't know. But maybe you should talk to Father Jameson because he probably knows. I think being authentic and real about that is most important. And please don't make stuff up. Like if you don't know the answer, that's worse. Right. You can look everything up on your phone and you'll know that they're lying. So yeah, I think is that helpful? Okay. Anybody else?
You had a slide, a couple slides ago. Back one more. I think that one, when the guy was in the business, the next slide.
Oh, was it this one?
Yeah, this one. I just like that slide. And I'm also, Jonathan knows this, but I'm in a small Bible study class with some friends and a couple of adults, old adults, that have crisis of faith at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, I think that, it's for everybody, really, like to know that God is always creating life where there isn't, When you think about Hannah, all the barren women in the Bible, there's so many moments like this where, God is at work, and we all need this assurance. Like, I love what we get to do because it assures me and my team of the promises of God. This is something that we all need constantly, right? So that's why we do Compline. That's why we have all this liturgy integrated into our lives, because we are so forgetful, as soon as it's just Exodus is full of the forgetfulness, as soon as they get out from Egypt, they're complaining, they're whining, the water's terrible. I'm like, the water's terrible. Like, it's just so many complaints. We forget about who God is all the time. And so we need these reminders.
the slide caught my eye. She looked through and I said, that's great.
Yeah.
What I enjoyed is when you said it's just true. I questioned at one point an uncle of ours who's a brilliant physician. Like, how can you believe this? And he said, you just drop it completely. You have faith. And, it's just true.
Yeah, and I think there are always moments of doubt, right? So, it's just who we are as humans. We're always, we put ourselves in the position of a creator all the time, and we burden our own selves with thinking that we've got to do it all and we've got to keep it all together on our own. And we forget that we are not many gods and that we are creatures and not the creator. And so this is a constant battle between who we are, but in our own humanity, in our own experience. And so that's something that we can offer young people who are considering or not considering the church, but it's just like we all struggle with the same thing. We all have the same illness. But I've found balm in Gilead, and I want to tell you about that because it's relieved my life in so many ways. And I forget about it, and then I remember. And so it's a constant, and that's why it's so important to stay engaged, because we all need those reminders. We need to be reminding one another. Like the thing that Sophia told me about being afraid at night and believing in Jesus, I was like, well, that was really great for me too, because sometimes I'm afraid. And, that's, thank you for that. And so there's just all these opportunities.
Jesus was afraid, right before crucifixion.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, I mean, my oldest is 8. So what are some things that I could do to help them with like, I don't think I've seen anxiety. And maybe they have anxiety. I think they hear things in school from others, but they're not exposed to some of those things, I guess.
Yeah, Alpha's going to be an interesting generation because they're saying that they're like a swingback. So and my Henry is like on the cusp of that, and so sometimes I think like, where did you come from? Like I just they're rebelling against whatever is sort of popular at the moment. We're seeing a lot of that trend. So I think tradition is not going to be, that's going to be their rebellion. They're like, well, we go back to church. It's a whole different ball game for those guys. But I would, everybody's saying, all the data is saying to keep kids off of social media as long as possible. Like if you can get them to 16 off of social media, you're in really good shape. But it's a battle. It's a hard thing to decide how to navigate those waters. But there's nothing really positive that people are saying so much about it. So
We have someone down the street that's from Palestine, and like they have their flags flying, and like I made the mistake of trying to explain this to my child, and it was just really like I fumbled a lot, and so
I mean, on that note, like I've been thinking as I've like looked at this slide, like give them hope. Like it doesn't say like give them answers. Like I don't think that we can like put it upon ourselves to like have that answer. Like my 10-year-old does have like major anxiety. Like he had a panic attack at school and like had no idea what was happening. It's like post like Ukraine war, like all this stuff, like in his world, it's just like, he feels like, well, Ukraine can't be that far away. And like when he came home and talked about that, the thing that gave him hope was when I was like, oh yeah, I have panic attacks. I actually like take medicine so that I don't have panic attacks. And he was just like, it's kind of like, holy crap, like, wait, you're like
the
30
dad.
years older than I am. And like you are alive and you've made it through that, right? And so like I think that it's interesting if you look at your 6 kind of like entry points, like if you piece those 6 things together, whether it's community or connection or identity or the future self, like those can all be the things that give hope, but it's not necessarily a directive from you. Sometimes it's simply like sharing in that same vulnerability that like shows them that like by your example of being 30 years older than them and somehow making it still, that like and you maybe do share those anxieties or those skepticisms or whatever, that like that is hope. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, one of my our good friends, Aaron Zimmerman, who's a priest in Waco, he was talking about hope and weariness, and he said, you can't have hope without knowing things are bad. So to say like I'm hopeful doesn't mean that you don't know things are bad. It means that you know things are bad and you live with the promises and knowing that there is hope in front of us. So, yeah, that's so great. So disarming.
that also reminded me that like sometimes, because Jed always has anxiety, we'll be like, you do certain things really well. Like you've always known that these are really like you've been solid on this, but there's other people that haven't learned that, and they might not learn that for like 30 years or something. They may never learn it, but everybody's working on something. And so like in my area, like I don't know the answer for this and that, and it might not even be related to whatever he's struggling with, but it's just basically saying, like, I'm not fumbling for the answer. Essentially, I'm just like what you said, like I'm allowing their space for connection and like a conversation to keep going where now we're on an even playing field as opposed to like I'm the one that knows everything and I'm telling you how it's gonna go. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we always like to say that the winning is in losing, and humility is like key to success as a parent. And if we pretend that we have all the answers, and so many of us were raised with parents who didn't feel comfortable and vulnerable enough or safe enough to say, like, I don't know, or I'm sorry. And so you know what that does. That builds walls, and you're not connected, and you're afraid to tell them stuff. And so I think as much humility, and, I think that that's so key in the parenting. Yeah. Mm.
How do you begin planting the concept of faith in a 5-year-old, pretty intelligent? Where do you start?
He's not at St. John's. It's far, far away.
I think it's got to be more than just little stories, don't you?
I don't know. I think stories have all gotten us here today. I think it's this, like, the redemptive story that probably brought each and every one of us to these seats today. Without a story, none of us would be here. And so I think there's so much power in the story. Sally Lloyd Jones has a great Bible book out there, the Jesus Storybook Bible. That's a fantastic. We have a catechism for littles. You can start there, faith guide for littles. But I think building in the practice of prayer and engaging the stories of the Bible is the place you start, because faith comes by hearing, and that's how Jesus came to all of us, through telling us parables, and that's how we all have faith, is through the story.
When my daughter was 3, I'm sorry,
I think, do you mind if we keep going, so we don't have time to talk?
Yeah.
Is that right? Sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just saying, well, first of all, I'm not a Gen Z or an Alpha.
Yeah, me neither.
But I just was gonna ask a question and comment, is that, I think that my faith was completely driven by my family, my parents, the direction and kind of that, of both faith and religion. With that said, religion and faith also being, they're facing many different battlefields right now in the current environment. And, one of the kind of key components that keep coming back around is social media and/or media in general. And that's a really significant thing, because at the end of the day, you have certain topics that, from childhood, let's just say, and I'll name a name that probably everybody would recognize or knows, Greta Thunberg, who talks about, like, the environment as if it's God, right? And we actually had a speaker here recently about the connection between, the environment and, and its place within kind of faith and religion and how that's important. But at the same time, like, it's kind of crazy that, she has so much kind of influence and power over youth as it relates to kind of like that topic in general versus kind of the topic of religion, faith, and, church. And so I'm just curious, kind of like your thoughts as it relates to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are so many competing forces. We want to be good people in so many ways, and I think when you're a young person, you imagine life in a very black and white. It's either good or bad, and it's hard for them to discern, like, the complexities of what life is. And so, like, Greta's come to New York, and all of the schools let the kids out, and it was just like a big day, and then they all came back really anxious and nervous about the world. And so, but I don't know, where they're so prone to all of the competing forces that are coming at them all the time. And so I think that we come to them with a lot of compassion and approaching them as if they've been traumatized, because they're traumatized with so much information. And I think that we just remind them of the stories and what's most important. We all have vocations in life. There are doctors, and there are priests, and there are lawyers, and we all have the roles that God has set us up to be, so that we can serve our neighbor and love one another. And so we can encourage them to know that God has a plan and a story for them too. And they're not meant to be saddled up with the creator space, and they are meant to live into the creature space. And so they're meant to identify who they are and what God has called them to do, and then to live into that. And we can't do everything. We're not God. And so we just have to remind them that, hey, mama, you're a creature, not a creator. And so I'm so glad that you care about the world, and I'm glad that you care about the things that God has made, actually. And so let's pray about that, and let's see where we can, I don't know. So I think that that's the first place to start.
Can I, just as
Yeah.
a follow-up, is there a balance between too much coddling in terms of kind of that age group, or is it like, I don't know, I'm just asking the question, but like, it seems to me that they need a lot of like coddling and or like, everybody gets an award and all that kind of stuff. I didn't win everything when I was growing up. I won a lot, don't get me wrong, but,
Yeah.
I'm just curious, that seems to be a little bit of the, challenge with kids these days, right?
Well, and
I'm just asking, I don't have kids, by the way, I'm just asking.
have you read Coddling of the American Mind?
No,
That's another Jonathan Haidt. I don't know. I think people have to discern. I think that kids are they're living with extremes. It's like like they're either overly coddled or they're like there's a war going on. Like there's so much that they're navigating. So it's hard to say. Oh, someone in the back. Yeah,
A follow-up
Sarah.
to that.
Yeah.
So I am so blessed to teach your curriculum to our children. And the church sent me last spring to see you, and it was the most phenomenal conference. And I'm so glad everybody here now gets to see your genius and your inspiring energy that I've talked to so many about you. I mean, all of it. So it's amazing. But going to that point, this morning we were teaching, and Mel was in our class, and we were teaching Exodus, and we were teaching the pillar of cloud and fire. And one of the pages in her curriculum is, what are you scared about? What is scary in your day-to-day life that God has helped you with? And the things that the children just sat and thought about, it's almost like they didn't know it was that scary. It was almost like in the back of their mind, and now all of a sudden they're like, oh, this was scary, and God helped me through it. So I love that your curriculum addresses that there is this chaos in life. God's stories are not all like happy endings. Like they are going into this pillar of clouds and fire, and it's a little intimidating.
Well, one student said, he was like, well, I mean, what happens when they get out of the Red Sea? Like, they don't have a house. I was like, yeah, they're refugees. All of a sudden, refugees. Like, they got out, they've had one trauma, now they have got to figure their lives out. And the student pointed that out. He's like, well, now what? And I was like, I know exactly, now what?
How are they going to afford a house?
Yeah.
What are they going to do when they get there?
They've got nothing.
Like, and that's what I think you do so well, is that it's not just like this happy story. Like you're showing, like it is hard. Like and we even all said, like life is hard. Like, but God helps us.
Yeah.
He's there for us. Like he sees us through it. So anyway, I just have to say thank you for all you have given our
Oh,
children.
thanks, Sarah.
Because you saw today how much
They were so
value
good.
they are getting out of it. It is amazing. And I personally enjoy it so much. I've learned so much through you. So
Thank you, Sarah.
That reminds me of the slide with the diagram, I guess, where they can write I don't remember if it was, they can write about I don't know if it was what they're scared about or what they're, but sometimes you have to like bring it out of them, like, because I wouldn't know
right.
to like, some of them are more, they're gonna keep it inside. So you have to like bring it to the surface. And that, yeah, it was this one.
Yeah, I think
It's a great way to.
art really affords that and that play space. And then when we play alongside them, it makes a huge impact and they remember that. It's like, oh, my dad played with me. Or, my husband's a priest, and we were doing one of the zines and activities and an art activity, and one of the questions was like, what are you afraid of? And we all drew something, and then my husband shared, and then he had a picture of a board meeting, and he was like, this is my vestry meeting, and it's a finance meeting, and and all of a sudden it's like the kids understood, like, oh, you have stuff too, like, they're detached, they don't know you have to do financial reports. So, it brings connection, that art, that opportunity, and everyone's doing their thing, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, we're connected again.
Can I butt in and ask
Yeah.
a quick question? Kind of following up with what Anne's question was. So I'm so glad we have this good formation on Sundays, but how have you found helpful for bringing that into the house, like our homes, and like how to talk to kids, and the younger kids, not just Gen Z. Like my kids are 7 and 10, basically.
Got some
So, like,
alphas.
what's been successful? Because it can be hard figuring out how to like incorporate prayer
Practice,
and,
yeah.
and just some sort of formation.
The rhythms, yeah, it's so hard. I think what's mostly against us is time and schedule, and it's just we're all overwhelmed and there's not enough time. And so one of the things we do know is that families have the most spiritual formation impact on kids, more than the church. And so it's important to incorporate practice at home. But I would say it's really about quality and not quantity. Like if you can capture 15 minutes once a week, maybe Sunday evenings or whatever makes sense for your schedule, if you can lock that practice in, I think that you're winning, and that is setting the tone of like connection around the biblical narrative, and it's going to be something your kids remember. It doesn't have to be every night. It can just be once a week, 15 to 20 minutes, and then see what happens. Move through a season together, like Advent or Lent or Easter. Don't try to overdo it. I think that's what we mostly tried to do, is like, I'm going to do this spiritual practice with my kids. And like my husband sometimes is like, we're going to do Compline for all these weeks. And I'm like, I don't think that's going to work. We don't have time, schedules, all the things. And so it's like, really, you get 15 minutes. And if it can be meaningful, it's something that they're going to remember and come back to. And it's like, you know what? I did this thing with my dad, and he drew a really bad cartoon, and I'm better at that than he is. And then we had great conversations and silly questions. So, yeah.
And then they can see that it's not just true hypothetically, but it's true in your life, right? And in your practice.
It becomes integrated, and you realize it's so funny, because I think we get so busy and we get we feel so responsible for so many things, and so we forget to get into these rhythms, even if they're like 5-10 minutes a day, the first thing you do. We just so desperately need that reorientation and that remembrance of the promises, like before we go into our day. Like, I think as grown-ups, if we can adopt our own practice, then that is going to spill out into the rest of the household, because then we're more centered. I mean, just think about it. Like, if you start your morning in prayer and you have a minute to sort of get your mind together before all the things come at you, I know I'm nicer to my kids, and they have a better morning, and they have a sweeter mom walking them out the door, and that is way more meaningful than if I like caught 3 more emails before I got my kids out the door. So I think that it begins with us, and then it trickles out to the rest of the household. Yeah.
Do you have one last question, or are we takers? All right. Well, let's give Melina